case study of the Gainesville Area Chamber of Commerce. My name is Crystal Moore, and I'm Vice President of Professional Development here at ACCE. And we have a great webinar scheduled for you today. Tim Giuliani is the President and CEO of the Gainesville Chamber of Commerce, and he is also a very good friend of ACCE, has served on the ACCE board and as well as the Membership Development Committee for ACCE. So he's well versed in this topic, and we look forward to a great session. A couple of housekeeping notes. Please put your phones on mute if at all possible, and please do not put us on hold. Some of you have hold music, and sometimes if your phone is unmuted and you put us on hold, we can't continue the broadcast. A copy of this presentation will be available along with the recording after this event. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and use the chat function that is on your right-hand side panel. We'll be glad to take questions during the presentation, and we will, in about 45 minutes into the presentation, have a Q&A session where you will be able to raise your hand using the software, and we will call on you at that time to audio your question. But again, feel free to chat your question. Tim, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Crystal. And hello to everybody. This presentation, I hope at the end you'll be exposed to a process and a very good resource or two. Regardless at what stage you're at in your career, I believe you'll find it handy. I'm not an expert in this. I don't have a PhD, but I have 8 years working with chambers in different capacities, and I also have a lot of recent experience with this topic, and so I've taken some time to digest the material and to put it in a way that I think is beneficial to somebody, whether they're leading a certain part of a chamber or nonprofit, and then all the way up to how you lead change as a CEO. And coming back to where this gets its importance, in my mind, Confucius has a very famous quote that probably many of you have heard that says the only constant is change. So when we look, I think everyone would agree if we were sitting around the table having a discussion instead of this format over the phone and internet, that leading change is one of the very core skills that we all need, particularly in this type of economic and political environment and in these type of roles that we serve, where the dynamics are always changing. The underpinnings of the chamber business model is always an evolutionary process, and if you picked up the latest version of Chamber Executive Magazine, you'll see that as a common theme throughout this edition. So it's certainly something we deal with on a day-to-day basis, and so it's probably important for us to build our capacity and our knowledge around this topic. And so I've taken some time to dive a little bit deeper on the topic, and I'd like to share some of that with you. What I'm going to start with, I have an outline here. I want to just give you a little bit of a brief background of the organization that I'm responsible for now, just to ground you in what I'm working with. Quick on the personal and professional background, just so you can maybe relate, just some similarities we might have. To introduce, next is to introduce John Kotter, who's at Harvard, a well-known international expert on management and particularly on change. We're going to review his model for leading change, which I think is the best out there. Then take a look at a case study involving the chamber that I run here in Gainesville, Florida, and what you might learn from that, and then some recommendations that after going through this process, in different roles, and most recently as CEO, there's some things that I've learned, and the best value that I've gotten out of peer networking and learning like this is just learning from other people's examples. So hopefully, at the end of the day, you'll learn some things from this webinar and not make some of the same mistakes I did, and then make your organization even better than it is now. So very briefly, we're a 90-year-old chamber. Most of them are old like that, so they've been evolving for many years. We're a 1,200-member organization. One important fact for the Leading Change segment is that there was a leadership team. I was named CEO here 1 year ago in August of 2012. And so up until that point, there had been a leadership team in place for 10 years. And so I think that was an important and relevant topic, and some of you can relate to that. And if you can't today, when that phone call comes for you and you go to lead an organization or a division, this might be a dynamic you're dealing with. So as an organization, we do economic development, and that's been since the 1990s when that was brought and merged with the chamber. And then we also have a workforce division for the last 8 years or so. So we have an economic development division and a workforce division within our chamber, just to give you some context. And this organization is 5-star accredited by the U.S. Chamber. So it's fairly sophisticated. I've worked with many chambers throughout the country, and I've always held this organization in high regard. So it's clearly a situation, and we're just a strong organization, very sound financially. So there was no, hair on fire or items that were burning that I came into. So that's part of the context as to what the environment and the factors were that my case study is going to be relevant to you in. I also put up this picture because most of those people, when that picture was taken at a welcome reception that was put on when I moved back to Gainesville, most of those people are no longer with the organization. So we've had quite a change process occur here. And so I just want to highlight some of those items for you, realizing that I'm really trying to grab the salient points that I think are relevant and worthy of sharing. A lot of the more emotional, very challenging and complex issues, I don't think we have time for today, and those are more case-by-case basis. And so I left that stuff out and just tried to include the part that I think was transferable and very valuable to share with you. Just a quick background on me, give you some context. I went to Florida State, majored in economics and communication. So unlike most people, I get to have a profession in aligned with my educational background. I also went back at the University of Florida here in Gainesville for my MBA. I have been working in public affairs and nonprofits for the last 15 years, and so I did start very young. I was at this organization previously as director of membership, and so that was also a dynamic to deal with as far as leading change of what happens when you manage people that you used to report to. Interesting dynamics. I did spend the last 5 years at our state chamber. So in addition to being on ACCE's board and being involved in the membership division for a number of years, working with chambers around the country, I've also had the opportunity while I was at the state chamber to help organize our partnership with local chambers here in the state. So I have seen a lot as far as other organizations and how they operate. And then, as I said before, I came back here as president in August of 2012. So that's kind of laying the groundwork for you as far as what does our organization look like, what's my background, what are some of the dynamics involved in this change management process that will be particularly relevant when we get to the case study. I thought the first thing we should do is just walk through Kotter's 8-stage process. If you haven't read John Kotter's book or gone to his website, I'd encourage you to do that. There's a lot of clutter. There's a million business books out there. There's tons of blogs, tweets. you're just bombarded with information if you want it on management and leadership. But John Kotter really cuts through so much of that clutter and in a way that everyone can understand lays out this process. He does note at the beginning of his book that 70% of change management processes ultimately fail. So not everybody gets this right. And additionally, this is not a ladder of progression as it relates to the stages. So in other words, you can't take on task 1, which is establishing a sense of urgency, complete that, and then move on to step 2, complete that, move on to step 3. What happens in many cases is you get 50 to 75% of the way in stage 1, and you begin stage 2, and you can start on that, and you make some progress, and then you can get into step 3. So he's very careful to explain you don't want to get out of sequence, and that's a great temptation. If you're anything like me, you want this process to take somewhere between 3 and 5 days, or even 3 and 5 months. But I've learned a few times, and most recently very clearly, this process takes, in our world, I would say a couple years to really complete the entire process, the entire change process, although a significant amount can be accomplished in a year. And I'll share that in the case study. So let's walk through these 8 stages. You see them, they're on the screen. So let's start with establishing a sense of urgency. A very easy step to overlook, but one of the most important, and actually one of the areas where ACCE can provide you a tremendous value. This is the stage where you really need to make a case. This is, another book that you might have seen in the bookstore from John Kotter deals with a parable about penguins, of the iceberg is melting. And so I've read that a number of years ago. It's one of those books that takes about an hour to read, very short, concise. It talks about the penguin that would swim under the iceberg, and the penguin was young and saw the iceberg was melting and couldn't get anyone to believe him. And so this has to do with whether you're taking over a new division, whether you just believe it's time to do things a different way, whether you're taking over an organization. There's a lot of trigger points that causes us to want to implement a change management process. But the first step is clearly articulating why. Why now? Why does this have to be addressed? If you've spent a lot of time working with boards of chambers or other nonprofits, you realize that as much as they care about the organization and want to see it succeed, implementing a lot of change, it takes a lot of work. It's extra time. It's a lot of extra commitment to ask of volunteers. And so you need to make a very clear case and convince them of why, not only why is a change needed, but why is it needed right now. The second phase, which you can start as you're developing and putting the final touches on stage 1, is building that coalition that's going to help you see this change through. You do not want to rely just on your own intuition and your own ability to create change. There needs to be other people with you. And so certainly you want to grab people that have power to engage them in this process, and that could be people that are in clear, very obvious positions of power, whether it's chairman of the board, a vice chair of the board. If you're operating a division, it could be a key employee. But it goes beyond just the titles. It goes to people that are the real influencers, the larger funders, those people that have the respect, the influence, the persuasive ability to bring people along with them. So it's very important to build that group that see things the way you see things, that's willing to go to bat. Because I could tell you when we get into the case study and when it gets challenging and when you have people dissenting against your change, those are the people that are going to get the phone calls asking what's going on. And if they're on your team and they see the urgency, they understand the vision, they'll back you. And you may never know that those phone calls or those emails occur, but trust me, they do. So you want to make sure that you've built a coalition that's in this with you. The next stage has to do with developing the vision and strategy. And I can tell you from my own experience, coming in as the new CEO of a company, of a chamber, I felt the need to come in with a vision and how we were going to accomplish that. And I can tell you there's a few phone calls that I made as this process was unfolding, and it was clear I was going to get the position. So Joe Reagan in St. Louis, Bob Quick in Lexington, Kentucky, all people I've met through ACCE. I talked about this process, and I also picked up the book, You're in Charge, Now What?, which I'd also recommend, particularly when you get that first job as a CEO. Because so much is going through your head, and you have to be in decision-making mode immediately. As soon as that announcement's out there, you're on. And so getting your head in the right frame of mind is something I've done since day one. I knew that if I would just do a good job at what I was asked to do, that things would work out in the long run, and that I would one day run an organization in a community that I wanted to live in and to raise kids in. And so when that opportunity came, I fortunately gained the wisdom through other people that had been there. You don't have to walk in with your vision. You don't have to have all the strategies identified. In fact, you're much better off if you allow that to develop over the first year or two of being in that role. So same thing with taking on a new division or becoming a vice president. You clearly need to have some ideas, and you need to have a process, and you need to understand where you're going. But there's a lot of benefit in having other people along with yourself develop the vision and strategy and plan. And there's a lot of research that's been done on this that I've looked into, a lot of case studies, a lot of stories that you can find online and in other places of CEOs that really took the route of allowing that vision and plan to come together once you were in the saddle. And I think Kotter stresses that. And once you create that urgency, you build your coalition of volunteers, of staff, then allow the vision and strategy to come to the forefront. Once you have it, you need to communicate it. And this is something that when you think you've done enough of communicating the change vision, you've probably only just gotten started. This is over-communicating. This is telling people over and over and over and communicating it in different ways and using different vehicles. And the ironic thing here that I've learned from this stage is that oftentimes you're communicating this change and this vision to people that are incredibly smart, incredibly experienced and accomplished, and that really doesn't matter. You still need to re-emphasize and re-communicate this change vision over and over, because you don't know where their mind is the first 2 or 3 times you're telling them this. They don't even, they may not even be on the same page as what a chamber does. Even if they're on staff, there may be some confusion, or they've been on your board for 5 years. You almost have to assume that you're teaching everybody and that everyone needs to hear it between 5 and 7 times before it really sinks in. Because what you're after is somebody understanding where the organization's going to the point that they can then begin suggesting tips or ideas or tweaks to your plan that you're going to find very valuable, but you can't get to that good insight that they can all bring, whether they're on staff or whether they're part of your board or community leaders, until they can really digest and understand where you're going. So I think this is just, do whatever you think you need to do and then multiply that by 10, and that's probably a more realistic picture. So step 5 of 8 is empowering employees for broad-based action. At the Gainesville Chamber, we took a slightly different approach to developing a strategy and vision. We engaged a lot of people in that process. We also produced our document that exists on one page. So it's simply directional. It's a strategic direction. We're calling it a platform. And it doesn't prescribe everything to do over the next 3 to 5 years like most strategic plans do. And one of the main reasons for doing that, and in our case, in Kotter's example and his process is empowering employees, and that's certainly part of what we need to do in our organizations, but you also have to empower your volunteers and others associated, whether they're ambassador or diplomat, member of the board, members of committees, etc. They need to feel part of the process and empowered to contribute. And so I didn't go about setting a new course feeling that I had all the answers and all the strategies that would ultimately work. Instead, I brought on a team that has tremendous experience, has the right passion, has the right attitude and personality that would mesh and that would build a good culture, and really empowered them once the direction was set and they even influenced that, allow them the opportunity to buy in and to have their ideas heard and to have their ideas acted on. It really creates a team atmosphere. Our planning sessions going into 2014 involve the full staff. We have about 20 people on staff here. We have a board retreat coming up where we're going to have breakouts on different aspects of the platform. So this is really about getting people involved. And if they understand and your vision and the strategy is not saying it's not sophisticated and on point, but simple, it has to be simple to understand and to grasp so that once they get there and understand where it's going, you never know where the next great idea is going to come from. So I think that the next best idea for membership can certainly come out of communications, and you just don't know where those good ideas are going to come from. So making sure you build in a process for getting the employees involved, empowering them, and really relying on them to provide a lot of the meat and the direction for implementing this vision. Next is, in the process, is generating short-term wins. And we've all heard of this. It's obviously something that we all have considered in the past, but it's key to this process because people have to see all of this planning and strategy talk, envisioning, which maybe many of you on listening love, like I do. I love the strategy part. Some people really hate it. And so showing early wins, no matter which camp somebody's in, allows them to see your plan in action. And so we recently had a win. We've had a couple of them. And so we've taken extra time to communicate about those wins, to describe. It's just going back to the communicating your vision. It's just another way of describing the change. Only this time they can really see it. They can really feel it. Some people need learn differently, and they really see themselves in it, and they played a role, and now they really get it, and now they can go implement that in other parts of the organization. So as determined and as focused as we are as implementing the change, we have to realize the value that comes with these short-term wins. And it goes back to my comment earlier that this is not something, this process is not a 3 or 5 day or even 3 or 5 month time period. This is something that really takes time. And so here's a good example of this just takes time to generate those wins and to reinforce that change and that it's working. Almost to the end here, number 7, consolidating gains and creating more change. So even the person responsible at the top, whether that's the top of the division, of the affiliate, or of the whole organization, you don't even know what your change will ultimately lead to. Because, number one, there's going to be unintended consequences and things you just didn't foresee happening. And second, we all, in a successful implementation, we'll create new ways of thinking, new strategies, new ideas that will breed new strategies, new ideas, just completely new ways of thinking about things. So what we're experiencing in our organization is now that we're entering this stage, although I would argue that steps 1 through 6 are not yet 100% complete, we are already beginning to see where people are taking the short-term victories, understanding how it works and what the value is, and then going and finding new ways to implement that vision and strategy. This also talks to credibility. So it speaks well that the process is working, that the structure's in place, and the policies are all starting to work. You're also, at this stage, going to experience different types of employees, whether that's people that adapt or people that enter the organization are now coming in when the change process is being implemented and is more than halfway home. So you're bringing in people that don't even remember the old culture at this point and are starting fresh and understand the new vision and just assume that that's just the way it is and see themselves in it and join the organization because of it and can really move the ball forward for you. Last is an ongoing step, and that's really being able to draw the connections of the new behaviors, the new success, and turn that into long-term leadership, succession. The ultimate complement or the ultimate sign of success is that when people change, because people will change, and especially in our industry, that the change survives, that it's not simply just because of one person anymore. It may have started with one person, but ultimately so many people in the organization internalized it and made it their own that over time it just becomes the way it is. It just becomes the culture, it becomes the expectation, it becomes the accountability, and the culture is just clean and new and completely in line with this new change management process. So those are the 8 steps, and you can be in 2 or 3 or 4 steps at one time at different phases because it just works like that, and that's the way Kotter's described it. So I've already touched on how this applies in our example here at the Gainesville Chamber, but let me just specifically walk through for you, and if you have questions, please do type them in the chat. But let's take maybe 5, maybe even 10 minutes and just walk through this case study of what it's like in the real world. You know, you take it out of the book, out of the research, and apply it. And so what happens? So I gave you a little background on the type of organization I walked into, coming back to the organization, about 20 staff, about a $2 million budget, about 1,200 members, and with a leadership team that had been in place for 10 years. 5-star accredited, positive perception and brand in the market. But as the young penguin swimming under the iceberg would share, you know, there was some issues that just weren't being talked about that were affecting the organization or limiting the organization. And so I had to come in and create this new sense of urgency, this new reasons why we needed to take things to the next level. So I would imagine many of you that are either CEOs or someday soon will be in that seat. One of the items that's going to be impressed upon you during your hiring process is taking things to the next level. And that's certainly true of people being hired in management positions or as in vice president positions. It's a very non-descriptive way of asking someone to do a good job. So you really have to prescribe what that means and define it. And so I had to spend a lot of time early without talking negative about the past, be very forward-looking, and create the urgency for where we were going. We were going to need to do things differently. And so there's some things here from flat membership base, and there's reasons for that, but not growing as an organization, for having different plans and different aspects of the organization without one overarching vision, mission, strategic plan. So that was lacking. So there were some real needs for the organization to assert itself. And so we had to create a sense of urgency. And in this stage, I really had to do a lot of this legwork. And I did use ACCE's resources in Hero to benchmark our organization and to show, why we were a 5-star chamber, and that's certainly important and valuable, but we weren't invited to apply for National Chamber of the Year, and there's very specific reasons for that. Our retention rate was lower than average. Our first-year retention rate was horrible, and so there were some key metrics that we had to fix. And so I brought those to light to say, if we are going to take it to the next level, here are some things that we're going to have to address. And so people got the message that we had to start doing things a little bit differently than they'd been done before. Some people were ready for that, and some people weren't. But I did build the Guiding Coalition. And if you're looking at the screen, you can see I've indicated percentages of where I think we are today, which is essentially 13 months into my term as being president of the organization. And you can see I'm at 0 and I'm at 100% in any category, not at this time. So in other words, I don't feel like anything's finished, nor do I don't think I've gotten to start any part of it. So to you, maybe hearing this for the first time of this process, it is a little nebulous, and it is case by case. But by following the pattern and by following the processes in order, you start building on itself. So you can see some of the early stages, like the sense of urgency and the Guiding Coalition. I'm most of the way there. But when you get down to 6, 7, and 8 in the process, I'm just really feel like I'm getting my feet wet. So the urgency was set early on through the interview process, through my onboarding. A very successful technique I used that was an idea that came from one of those CEOs I had mentioned earlier that gave me advice before I got started, was to go out into the community and interview and meet about 100 people. And I interviewed them, and I took questions, I took their answers, I consolidated them, and I presented that back to the board, which put me in the authority role and as the one with all the insight, sort of like an outside consultant does. And to gain credibility, they do all the interviews. So it's kind of hard to challenge the person that's done the most questioning and the most data gathering. You gain some power by doing that. And that helped to build the Guiding Coalition. In this case, it was in large part the people that had hired me on the selection committee that was the leaders of our board, and it was some key individuals on staff. And I can tell you with absolute truth, it did not matter what position they had in the organization. There were people that formed that Guiding Coalition, and rather loosely, we never had a meeting as the Guiding Coalition, but that were just as close in advising me and being part of the process and the change process, from the receptionist that sits at the front desk of our organization to people in some leadership roles to our board. It did not matter what position they had. It's that they saw that change was needed. They saw a similar vision. They believed it could be done and accomplished, and they were willing to sort of weather out the storm to make it happen. So that Guiding Coalition was critical, and it spanned all types of people involved in the organization. Then moving on to developing a vision and strategy, and I can tell you the vision and strategy that we're moving forward with today would have been much different if this would have been done on day one. If I didn't follow Kotter's process, we would have been in a different spot, and I probably wouldn't have been too happy with where we ended up. But allowed it to iterate and to brew and to evolve in conversations. And I think what we ended up creating was a vision that was probably bolder than we would have. It was more of a shared vision than it was just mine. And the strategy really comes together nicely after you allow yourself to really understand the organization and the environment that you're working in. So I'm so glad it was a gradual process, and against all of my internal drive to make something happen immediately, this is certainly one where a little bit of pace, running the marathon instead of the sprint, really comes in handy. Number 4 is communicating that change vision. That seemingly takes forever. That becomes your main job, and you do this in everything. So from an email to staff celebrating a win, to sharing a newspaper headline with the board, making presentations at board meetings, to going out one-on-one and meeting with community leaders to share the new plan. All of these things, it just takes a relentless communication strategy to really get this message to people. Nobody is sitting by their phone waiting for you to call to share your change vision with them. You really have to make that work. So number 5, the empowering employees. I really went overboard to make sure that this happened. As a CEO, my own personal leadership philosophy is not command and control. It's delegate and empower. And there are people on our staff that have much more expertise in their areas than I do. And as long as I can communicate a clear vision, a clear direction, have agreed upon measurable outcomes, I want them to come up with their ideas. I've found a long time ago, getting involved in decisions that should be made by those on your team, you end up messing up the process. You always make the wrong decision. They have no ownership over it. You slow down and bottleneck the organization. And so going from a chamber that was well-performing and good, probably above average, to one that I think will be recognized as a model takes a team of experts allowed to run at their pace without needing me on a daily basis to check off on what they're doing. There's no way you can get there by doing the command and control, of making sure everything is just right. It makes no sense if you're really leading an organization and a community forward and you're going to be involved in public policy and economic development and workforce and international trade and small business development and talent. There's no way you can do all those things that we're charged to do and should do if you're going to run a command and control. So empowering employees, you've got to buck the trend. You've got to make sure that you find a way to pay people more. Just across the board in chambers, pay is low. We're going to have fewer staff people, but higher paid staff people, because you get what you pay for. And I really think that's a key to building a good team is being very transparent that this is your strategy and that you're willing to have a couple less on staff. But if you're able to get those at the high level, it really gives you the ability to delegate and empower people. And I just put up that picture on the slide if you're looking at it. It's all about communication. That was an event we had when we were asserting ourselves in the public policy debate on behalf of small business, which is something that hadn't been done here in a while. I think we have someone that sat in my seat a while ago, so I know that it had been done in the past. But it's been a while since this organization has started itself in public policy efforts. And so there we were again, communicating that vision. Number 6, on generating short-term wins. Obviously in this process I'm describing to you, we're just starting to experience those. We did have a public policy victory of reducing utility costs for a short amount of time, which is something that's very important in our market and the environment that we're working in. And that really solidified all of the emphasis we had placed in public policy and why that was such an important role that the Chamber could play. So the fact that we went from a very mundane, not a player, to all of a sudden getting a 6-1 vote with a city commission that people didn't think we would succeed with on public policy issues, to having that be our first victory was quite a statement. We also gained a partnership. We're starting to work with some vertical markets to align our chamber strategy with our economic development strategy. It's a key part of our new platform. And so we developed a pilot program with our advanced manufacturers. And now the first meeting we had was on the front page of our newspaper. We had a full room, and so it was a great success. And we've spent a lot of time communicating that. And I'm sure if some of you that are on the team here or on the phone or we're familiar in our market, we haven't communicated enough, even though we think we're blue in the face. Some people haven't heard that for the first time. So we continue to communicate on those victories and just really put them into context. For instance, the day that we had the manufacturers event, the next day when it was in the paper, I sent out a memo to employees, I sent out a memo to our board, and just used it as an opportunity to reinforce all the visioning and strategy conversations we've had. We're now producing results. Number 7, the consolidating gains and producing more change. I think we're just starting to experience this in our process, in that once people, for instance, if you take the vertical market approach that we're exploring and doing a pilot with the advanced manufacturers, now some employees are seeing how that works and really saying, how can we apply this to the IT sector? Some people are, how does this apply to small businesses or startups? And it's going to be different for every vertical market we approach, but we're consolidating those victories and those gains, and now they're starting to create change that may have stemmed from the original vision and the original sense of urgency, but I honestly could not have foreseen some of those ideas a year ago that now other people are coming up with, because it's just like a ball rolling downhill. It just builds on itself. And last, the anchoring new approaches in the culture. For me, this also means establishing new job descriptions, new review periods, new dashboards. Particularly when we're talking about a change on this magnitude of this case study, of where you're really changing the entire organization, you need to make sure you're all in and that all of your systems and processes and procedures align with the new plan. And so in our case, we changed our vision, our mission, our brand. And so really making sure that that permeates the whole organization is important and affects everybody, so that you're not one foot in a new plan and one foot in an old plan and end up with no plan, because not everyone's on the same page. So to me, this really means anchoring this approach in our culture and everything we do. We changed our core values internally to align, and now that doesn't need me to implement on a day-to-day basis. In fact, I'm out of the office so much, it couldn't be me. But we've built the culture to the point, and are continuing to build it, that people are really enforcing it with their colleagues and with their coworkers, and sharing it with their volunteer committees and such. So it's taken on a life of its own at this point, and has its own legs, and it's developed enough where it can carry on without one person just pushing every single day. So I'll move into our last 2 slides to tie a bow on the process and on the case study, and just remind you, if you have any questions, type them in. Be happy to get to as many as we can. So recommendations to make sure everyone's able to take something away. They're on the screen. So number 1 of the 2 books I mentioned in the presentation. The first is Leading Change, which is the Kotter book that outlines this 8-step process And it's one of those things where it's worth buying, it's worth reading, and then it's worth putting on the shelf, because at different points in our careers, we're all going to need a new process. We're all going to have to introduce change. And what's the beauty of this process is whether you're trying to change something within a division or you're trying to change something as the CEO, it's applicable. So it works for so many people. So keeping it as a reference when there's so much noise and clutter out there in management and leadership, it just cuts through everything. So it'll always remain on my bookshelf. And then if you do take over as a new CEO, I have to share the book, You're in Charge, Now What? It's based on a ton of research, lots of interviews, and so it's very well-founded information that also, you could read 10 books or you could just read this one. I started reading these things early. I knew one day I'd be in a seat like this, so I've been getting my head around this for a long time. So these are some of the books that stick out to me. Next on the recommendation is always seeking knowledge and wisdom. When you take over a chamber or a new chamber or new part of an organization, you're not the first one to ever do that. So learning from what other people, that's why I volunteered when Crystal asked to do this webinar, is there's a lot of wisdom and insight that I got that helped me to be successful, and I think it's our obligation to continue it and to pass that on. The next item is saying Rome wasn't built in a day. As I'm sure there's many of us on the phone and listening that are of the same mindset, similar personality, got to get things done, really want it to happen tomorrow, and a real, true, deep-seated change management process takes time. I've had members of the selection committee here at this chamber talk to me, now that a year has passed, talking about that my personality and temperament was one of the reasons they felt very confident in selecting me. And I think that speaks to this saying and to this process, and that a true, deep-seated, successful change cannot happen by someone with a very fiery personality that wants to accomplish it in a week or a month. It really, that fire in the belly person can certainly be successful, but you've got to do this at a measured pace so that the change sticks and it's good. The other thing is that there's going to be people that don't want the same change and that don't share the same vision, and that's fine. In fact, it's a given in this process. And there's, Kotter speaks to this. I would agree with him in my perspective and my experience. You've got to get some of those people out of the way. And sometimes, as my 7-year-old is learning right now in science, animals do 3 things when their environment changes. They adapt, they hibernate, or they migrate. And that's the same thing that's going to happen when you change the environment in your organization. Your employees are going to adapt, migrate, or hibernate. And so you need to be very cognizant of that and be very strong-willed, very confident that you're headed in the right direction, which if you let this develop and take time, it has a better chance of being sort of the right strategy or the right vision. And build that guiding coalition so that when those tough decisions are made, you've built a team behind you and you're on steady ground, because it's not going to be easy. You're not going to want to do it. But at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do. Last 2, keep building on each stage and follow the order. Just to reiterate, that's a key that Kotter talks about, is making sure that you follow the order, but that you realize you can't get to 100% complete in a stage before you move on to the next. It's a little bit more fluid than that. And then I would argue, of all the, from my educational background, professional development is always ongoing. I'm always reading, looking at something new. That this process and that this topic of change management and leading change is so core to what we do that it really does need to be on our list of skills. I mean, we really need to be experts in this. And I see some of the names of the people on this call, much more experienced than I have, and I guarantee you the reason that those folks are successful is because they see this as a core. And so that's probably why they jumped on the call, to hear yet another perspective on someone that's gone through a change process and how did they do it. And so the next time this course is offered, I'm sure I'll be listening in as well and picking up some more insight and honing the craft of how you lead change. So I'll end, put my contact information up on the screen. I also put John Kotter's website. It's a tremendous resource for learning more information. And so with that, I hope you'll send questions, comments, insights you might have. This is an ongoing process, and I just welcome your questions or feedback afterwards. You know, ultimately wish these conversations could be sitting around a table because we could learn from each other, but given the limitations of technology, this will have to work. So, Chris, I don't know if you want to see if people want to raise their hand or ask questions through the chat. I'd be happy to handle it anyway.
Sure. We have one question in the chat function. What was your retention rate in your first year retention rate? And what was that? And was that enough to get folks ready to implement change alone?
Right. So that was just one metric that we looked at. What we did was compare some of our metrics using the ACCE operations survey, and there were some things that stood out. And one of them was first-year retention. So it was a metric we showed the board, and we were at 39%. Which puts us approximately in next to last place nationally. You know, this is certainly not something that anyone on staff or the board would have just known. It wasn't something that was looked at or measured. So that was definitely part of the sense of urgency that I built is, you know, how do you build and grow an organization when your first year retention rate is in the gutter. So we quickly mobilized our diplomats, in some cases ambassadors, to start tackling this. And they started tackling it right away. You know, it takes a while to see results, so I don't have any new results to share. But we do have, without waiting for the sort of the grand strategy to be put in place, we immediately took action and focused the diplomats on that. That's what they're looking at. On a monthly basis. So we should start seeing results this month or next month on first-year retention, since we just started addressing it towards the end of last year, and there's companies are starting to get their renewal invoices in the mail. So we should have some numbers on that, but it was a key metric we looked at.
Okay. The next question is, how do you get buy-in on a new project from the top down? And I'm assuming, are you the top?
Yeah, so I guess we need to assume that this question is dealing with somebody that's more of a manager or a vice president.
Yes.
So if I could have used a different case study at a previous chamber where I was a vice president and not the CEO. It's the same process. And to get buy-in, you know, Kotter would classify that as building your guiding coalition. And so to get buy-in, you've got to create that sense of urgency. And so I think just like in my case study where we talked about metrics and benchmarking to see where we were stacked against those chambers that were ranked in the top 10 nationally, this is what we used. I have and would today go back to that and first laying out the sense of urgency and the case as to why there needs to be change. And you've got to show it to the right people, and going to the CEO first might not be the best approach. You might want to get some buy-in and create a sense of urgency with some coworkers and colleagues before going to the CEO, so that it's more fleshed out, it's more thorough, it's more concise, and when you go to the CEO, it's just not you, it's 2 or 3 people on the team saying, hey, we've got an issue here, and the best thing to do is not cover up what may be your own mistake. Everyone makes mistakes, and everyone needs to continually evolve. So just putting those facts out on the table and say we've got to tackle this, if I had someone do that, I'd reward them and praise them for being willing to recognize when something just isn't working. So it comes back to that same process as the first step is really building that sense of urgency.
Okay. This one says, I am an employee of a very successful chamber. Do you have any ideas as to how to convince the highest management level that they need to change, shift focus to new and broader ideas? That's what got them here, won't get them there. To think bigger strategically instead of operationally. It's hard to argue with success despite any attempt to show where the success can lead long term.
Yeah, I could have written that question in the past. And where I am on it now is that most really strong leaders are continuing to evolve and change themselves. And there's people that have been on the call today that fit into that category that run very successful chambers. And it's because they're constantly willing to learn and adapt and take on something new. And that's why they, in most cases, got to where they are. So I think if you have a real visionary leader, they anticipate that things will need to change and keep going. Now, not everybody is like that. I can tell you previously there were some people on staff here at this chamber that had come up with good ideas in the past, had been successful in the past, but felt very complacent in that success. So you kind of have to identify the situation you're in. Do you have someone that's visionary and just needs a good case to make change and is willing to keep going and keep evolving? Or is it someone that's become complacent and isn't open to change? And so if I was in that situation, I wouldn't be able to handle that for long if someone wasn't willing to improve on mediocrity. If they're on my team, I wouldn't be anxious to have them around for long if they thought they had already made it and felt no need to continue to improve. So it's one of those things you really have to diagnose. Are you just needing to communicate your sense of urgency better and your case for change? Or are you dealing with people that feel very kind of resigned to the fact that they've been successful and they're just going to keep doing what's always worked, and then make your decision of what to do from there depending on which type of person you think you're dealing with?
Okay. We're going to try to take an audio call and see how that works. I'm going to call on Leslie Henderson.
Okay.
Leslie, can you hear?
I can hear.
Oh, great. What's your question?
You already answered it. Mine was the one on the retention rate.
Oh, got it. Okay. Well, thank you for your question.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Let's see. We have, what are your diplomats and ambassadors doing to help improve your retention rate? That's from Valerie.
Yeah, so this is funny because I'm going to admit what I don't think I did a very good job on. Because I used to be the membership director here, so I used to be responsible for the diplomats here. And I thought we had a really successful diplomats program because we had about 35 people engaged, regularly show up to the meetings and participate. And I thought that was a sign of health and vibrancy within a diplomats. Problem was they weren't focused on anything, and they weren't providing a measurable impact to the organization. So there really was no way to determine if they were successful or not. So, 5, 7 years ago, I thought I was running a successful diplomats program until I came back and had a different pair of eyes on it. And it wasn't that they were doing anything wrong, it's just that they had no direction. So once we discovered this low retention rate and went to the chair of the diplomats, and they kind of had caught wind that I was putting everything on the table and there was no sacred cows, and if something wasn't performing or making sense anymore, we were more than willing to get rid of it. So I think he had a little apprehension that we might be telling the diplomats that we didn't need them anymore. And I'd still do that today if they didn't serve a purpose and they weren't engaged in a meaningful way. But what we did was challenge them to say, listen, we've identified first-year retention. We're performing very poorly, and it's really going to inhibit our ability to grow and become more vibrant organization. Would you be willing to tackle this specific part of our retention and really do something that we as a staff aren't doing a very good job at? And so they jumped all over it. And so I'm sure not every single diplomats group would want to take on something like that. They're perfectly fine with their social aspects, but ours really wanted to feel like they were contributing to the organization and delivering something that was tangible, that benefited the organization. So they were more than willing to jump on first-year retention. So they've started taking over a lot of the touch program of reaching out, getting cards, making phone calls, getting them to events, getting them engaged. And so really what we did was took all the energy that was bottled up with these 35 or 40 diplomats and just focused them on first-year retention. And so I'm guessing we're going to see some much improved results in 2014 than we did this year because we had them focused and they could measure if they were being successful or not.
Okay. And I think this will be our last question to take us to the top of the hour. We are working on regional business development. We are working on a regional business development plan. Any online tools or books you can recommend to keep us on track?
I might be. A regional business development plan? Mm-hmm. Maybe any insight into marketing?
Possibly marketing and maybe partnerships.
Okay.
We have some information on our website that I think this is Lori, and I can send her some stuff on regionalism that may have some best practices, especially with organizations that are just starting the process.
Yep.
I'll be glad to send that to Lori.
Yeah, and actually, Crystal, we can share with her, we have a membership division newsletter that's getting ready to go out, and make sure she's on that list. I actually, as the chair of that division, wrote the message this month going in that newsletter that speaks to marketing and membership items to be considered in Q4 that addresses your strategy. And I think there's going to be I think that the tips that I put into that message will probably be relevant to Lori on looking at how you develop a strategy of identifying, a couple of very simple things. Do you know what your largest and strongest industry sector is, and do you have a strong value proposition for them? Are you going after your biggest opportunity, in other words? That's one, off the top of my head that I included. Another is just looking back and taking a Friday afternoon and looking in 2013 and saying, okay, on a list of 1 to 20 of all the things we did in 2013, what were the most successful and what were the worst performing? And change or get rid of the worst performing and double down on the strategies that were producing results. So those are two ideas that come to mind that I know are going to be in that newsletter, Crystal, that'll be sent out soon.
Okay. All right. That's perfect. Well, Tim, I guess one of the last questions, do you do surveys? Looks like someone asked, do you do surveys?
Member surveys?
Yeah.
Not very frequently. We do listen a lot, and we do ask members and talk to members, and we really value the input that we get from our membership department who are out talking to members every day. I'm a little bit weird when it comes to surveys. For instance, Apple spent exactly $0 on market research for the iPad. And so what I found over the years with chambers is that members really don't know what they want until they get something good or bad. So I would be more focused on an iterative process and of listening than surveys, because surveys are useful some of the time, but that has never been the core piece of how to develop strategy, just because I have never found the results to be all that insightful.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Tim, for this wonderful webinar. Thank you to all our attendees, and we'd also like to thank our sponsor, Save Local Now. Again, this webinar is recorded and will be available within 48 hours on our website at www.acce.org in our store. Tim, thank you again. I really enjoyed it, and again, his contact information is right there, and we look forward to you all attending our next presentation. Thank you and have a great day.